if we needed any reminding of the threat from terrorism that now, we now see running from the west of Africa right across the Middle East to South Asia. Sadly, it came this week with the killings in Tunis. It's a threat that I think some of our discussions, certainly in one of the night owls last night, of great complexity as well as geographical spread. We, as General Allen said, we find ourselves worrying about how to recreate government in Iraq. As Ms. Mogherini said, we see Libya sliding further and further into collapse, and we see the affiliation of lots of these radical extremist, violent extremist groups in West Africa, sort of on the back of the so-called Islamic State in Syria. So there's huge complexity, and the fight is there, but it's also here, as it were. We have our own homegrown, as people say, terrorists. So it's a really big and complex subject. We've got a great panel who can look at all the different dimensions. But I thought before I turn to them, perhaps I'd sort of see how awake everyone is by asking you a few questions. So if you can get out your mobile phones and iPads and whatever, we've got 3 or 4 short questions which will just, I think, give us some of the agenda for our discussion. So I'm going to give everyone sort of 30 seconds to work out and get up there, to get the applications working. Okay, the first question is these questions are not scientific, and a pollster would find all sorts of flaws with them, but they're just to get us thinking. This is, I think, question is one particularly for Europeans. We were talking yesterday about the sort of overturning of the European order by Russian intervention in Ukraine. But if we try to look out, which poses the greater long-term threat to Western security? Is it Russian revanchism in Ukraine and beyond? Or is it Islamist terrorism? So, straight, 1 or 2? I think we've got 7 seconds, 6 seconds to go. Okay, so this is, as far as this group is concerned, this is the real long-term as well as immediate threat. Second question. Who's the enemy in Syria? And I think different people take different views. Is it President Bashar al-Assad? Is it the Islamic State, Daesh? Or is it both? There you go, you've got 15, 14 seconds. So, predictable, most saying both, but interesting, only 4% saying it's Mr. Assad. I think a few years ago we might have got a rather different answer to that question. Third question. Okay, this is about the balance between our liberties and the need for our security. So post-Snowden and the ISIS success in recruiting foreign fighters, have Western governments got the balance between preserving individual freedoms and tracking terrorists with digital surveillance? Have they got it right? About right is number 1. It's too intrusive on freedoms. It's insufficiently comprehensive. So we got 13 seconds. So that seems to suggest that we should be doing more to tighten up security, which that rather surprises me. I thought there'd be more of a balance, but we'll go. That's something we're going to have to discuss. So, but let's go on to the last question. This isn't just a battle about hard security or about intelligence or about surveillance. It's also about communities. And this question is specifically about European governments. When we look at foreign fighters going off to Syria, do we think that we've done enough to extend opportunities to the Muslim communities across Europe? Or is there isolation and terrorism, radicalization linked? So have we done enough? Yes or no? It's a very straightforward question. No. That's good. That's a very, very strong no. So we haven't got to think entirely in terms of policing or security. We really have to think about the social structures in our European nations. Okay, now we've got some of the issues that we'll discuss, but not all of them. There'll be other things coming up. But I'm going to turn to the panel with a question to each of them, and I'm going to start with Derek Chollet, who's a senior counselor at the GMF and until December was an assistant secretary at the Pentagon, has served in the White House and State Department, so a very experienced American policymaker. And I want to start, Derek, with you with a question we asked at the beginning. When you look at this from the United States and the US administration looks at the myriad challenges around the world, it looks at Ukraine, it looks at Russia, it looks at the Middle East, the place it wanted to get out of a few years ago and is now being pulled back into. Which does it see? You know, if President Obama was answering that question, does he see Ukraine, Russia as the biggest threat, or does he see the rise of Islamist terrorism as the biggest threat to American interests?
So I don't know if this makes me conventional or really smart, but I agreed with the audience on all the questions. And I think in particular the first two, in terms of our urgent security threats and our interests, I would argue, and I believe the US argues as a whole, not just the administration, but our Congress, that the most urgent security threat to the United States and the most urgent transatlantic security threat is that of Islamic terrorism, and specifically ISIL. Why is that? First, it's the geographic footprint. In Iraq and Syria alone, ISIL covers territory that's roughly the size of the United Kingdom. And as we've seen recently, it's metastasizing elsewhere, in places like Libya, perhaps even in Tunisia. The resources that ISIS has, it's essentially financially self-sustaining. It's got a large degree of military capability that it has gotten from inside Syria, but then also, of course, unfortunately, some US supplied equipment in Iraq. And then finally, and I know it's on the minds of all the Europeans here, the foreign fighter flow, which is significant. The number of travelers to Syria is greater than the number of travelers we had at any point in the last 10 years to Afghanistan and Pakistan, to Yemen, to Somalia, even to Iraq during the war. So it's very significant. There's 20,000 foreign fighters in Iraq and Syria today, and roughly 3,600 from Europe. And to me, that's what explains Europe's willingness to be part of the military effort in Iraq, and I think that's frankly an underappreciated story in Washington, the willingness of European allies to step up and be part of the US-led air campaign in Iraq. We have a different set of allies working with us in the skies over Syria. But this will be a long-term effort, and that's why I think this is the challenge for all of us. It's certainly a challenge for us in the United States when it comes to resources and will. It's certainly going to be a challenge for our European friends as we look on the military side of this campaign for something that's going to last for many years.
Okay, can I just come back and press you, though? If that's the case, if it's understood to be the big strategic threat, why is the US half in and half out? If you look at the campaign in Syria, for example, this is, reluctant American interventionism. And it almost seems as if, the administration took a decision which may have been right a few years ago that we've got to get out of there. We've got to just, get back and maybe look at the Pacific. But circumstances have changed, but the administration is still sort of hamstrung by that sort of decision it's taken then.
Well, the fact that you're going to use the military tool to deal with this threat does not mean you use it to its maximum extent necessarily in every case. I think our view, the view of the Iraqis, the view of our European allies, is that a large ground presence in a country like Iraq would not help us solve the problem.
So you think you think the US is doing enough in terms of military and security intervention in Iraq and Syria?
I do. I do think it's still early days, because a key part of the strategy in both Iraq and Syria is to build up the capability, in Iraq's case, of the Iraqi security forces and help those security forces become more capable and unified. And in Syria, to build up the military moderate opposition, which is a project that's just getting underway and will take years to unfold. So in addition to our direct military action, which we're conducting through airstrikes, we're seeking to build up a ground presence of the Iraqi and Syrian forces.
Okay, I'm going to turn to Volkan Bozkir, the Turkish European Affairs Minister, and I'm going to guess he doesn't agree entirely with that last assertion that the US is doing all it could. So that's my first question to you, but my second question to you is, you're there on the border, as it were, and we've seen quite a lot of tension between the US and Ankara, and between some European governments and Ankara about how this problem is being handled. And frankly, Turkey's been accused sometimes of letting these fighters go through, not doing enough, of being ambivalent sometimes about the conflict between, say, the Kurds and the extremists. So can you give us your perspective and really explain how it's different from that of some of the Western governments?
If we just concentrate on Iraq and Syria, where now we're facing a kind of a different terrorism, I think one of the reasons is that U.S. went into Iraq too late and came out from Iraq too early, leaving behind unestablished democratic institutions and a state which could be called a democratic state, rule of law exists. Also in Syria, of course, when we were warning that if we don't stop it in the beginning, when it was Assad versus the opposition forces, now it is more than that. Hezbollah, Al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, Daesh is there. So we were warning that it might become an Afghanistan there, where terrorist organizations find the vacuum and come there to show how powerful they are, which is the case we are facing. In a way, I think the deterrency of the US is not with us anymore, because the US has given the message that US soldiers cannot be deployed outside of the country because the three Satans, Saddam, Osama bin Laden and Gaddafi is gone. So it is very difficult to convince the US people that US troops will be needed elsewhere and soldiers could be killed. So when we lost this deterrent factor, then as there's no other superpower in the world other than the US, I think these groups found really a strength in themselves, and that's what we are facing now. For example, when we talk about this Daesh, they started when US first entered into Iraq in 2003. The beginning is there. I mean, the Saddam's former soldiers, opposition to the US, and most of the militants were in a way trained in the Abu Ghraib prison and then released there, and we are now having a trained, ideologically and militarily trained groups, which I think...
We are where we are, but what should the US be doing now?
We can't get rid of this by just bombing some points. We need forces on the ground. For Iraq, I think it will be the Iraqi army. The composition of the Iraqi army is now being changed together with the US. It was a 95% Shia army was considered to be an oppression on the Sunni population there. Now, as the structure is being changed, I think the army can get rid of the Daesh remnants in Iraq. For example, when the Daesh got Mosul, it was 2,000 militants versus the 55,000 Iraqi army escaping, leaving behind their uniforms and the wonderful US weapons. And this shouldn't be the case. The army should take over. But in Syria, it's a different case. We don't have a state there. And I think the only way out is to deal with that unconventional forces by using unconventional forces, which I think after so many years, we came to the conclusion that we have to train those unconventional forces in Turkey or elsewhere, and then after equipping them, send them to Syria. They can handle that, but what we say is we need a no-fly zone because the Assad only has the air force superiority now. They don't have a land superiority. If they bomb our forces, which we have trained, equipped, and sent to Syria, then that would be damaging. So, no-fly zone, training and equipping the unconventional forces, and if we have a part which is cleaned from terrorism in Syria, we can send back some of the refugees by constructing houses and so. Turkey, as you have said, is blamed by letting European fighters to reach the terrorist group. But I mean, we have 39 million tourists coming to Turkey, and we can't check who is a terrorist, who is a tourist, who is coming there for academic life. Once the information flow, intelligence sharing started, we have stopped 12,500 persons, not all of them from Europe, but from all over the world, to enter into Turkey. And we captured 1,200 people who were already in Turkey, thanks to the information sharing, that we are doing our part. Turkey has never really worked together with Daesh and never will.
I just want to press you just on one point. The last time I was in Turkey, in Istanbul, the president gave a speech in which he talked about our Sunni brothers. And, you know, one sort of had a feeling that there's a sort of ambivalence there in the Turkish political establishment about, you know, where Turkey stands vis-a-vis, you know, particularly the Kurds and Daesh.
Well, I think that's a wrong concept you have got. Turkey is always in favor of, first of all, integrity of political integrity, territorial integrity of countries neighboring us. We have never thought about dividing countries according to religious sects. Okay. So in Iraq, this is the case. We have never said Iraq could be separated into pieces. And in Syria, what we are saying is that the regime, which is majority Shia, has to leave. But with that regime, when they were not killing their own people, with Bashar Assad, Turkey had good relations, and Bashar Assad is a Shia. It is, of course, we can't understand it if it was a Shia president and we had good relations until he killed his people, that Turkey had an intention of creating a Sunni province in Syria.
Okay, thank you. Now, we're going to come back from the region to Europe. And I want to ask Gilles, who's the coordinator for terrorism for the EU, and therefore has a sort of unique, sort of cross-continent, as it were, perspective. We've had a number of attacks in Europe. We're sending thousands of foreign fighters. Just perhaps if you could just sort of spell out the nature and the depth of the threat, and then I might come back to you and we'll talk about how we should be countering it. But if you could just sort of set out where the threat's coming from, how big it is geographically, and also in terms of the radicalization.
The threat remains serious, but it's much more complex than it was after 9/11, where we had an organization, Al-Qaeda, structured like a multinational company. We have, to make it a bit simplistic, three main sources of threat. We have young Europeans who have no contact with a terrorist organization, who have not traveled abroad, but they get radicalized either on internet, in prison. If you look at recent attack, it was mainly petty criminal who got radicalized in prison. Mehdi Nemouche, Mohamed Merah, the brothers Kouachi, Koulibaly. They have interaction with imams, and that's the first category. And they are inspired, to take the name of the magazine published by AQAP in Yemen, to mount an attack close to their house and a small-scale attack. And we know that even a small-scale attack may have an impact. So that would be the first category. The second one is, of course, the very high number. And you said in the 1,000, my assessment were probably between 4,000 and 5,000 European, which is huge. I don't suggest that all the returnees will fall into violence, but it's a very high number. And we know why it is worrying. These people get military training in Syria and Iraq. They get very radicalized. They develop a network all over the Arab world, which is very comrades in the fight. And I think they will have increased significantly their tolerance to violence. So that's the second one. And the third one, and I think something we have not to overestimate, is the fierce competition between Al-Qaeda and Daesh for the leadership of global jihad. And we may see at some stage, either in Europe or in some part of Africa, Al-Qaeda wanting to mount an attack to show that they are still relevant, they are still in the loop. And that was what the CIA described by the Khorasan group, a small group inside Jabhat al-Nusra of former veterans from Afghanistan, very, very well-trained, working with Al-Aziri, who is the world expert in explosive from AQAP. So this is the main three sources, but they are amplified by 3 or 4 factors. The first one is I'm afraid the very high number, probably increasing number of failed states or failing states, and we may come back to that. If we don't handle the returnees in a proper way, they may end up doing what the mistake we did with the Mujahideen at the end of the war in Afghanistan. We let them wild and lost in Waziristan, and it was the start of the problem for the Pakistani. So that's the first one. And they may want to move to Yemen or to southern Libya or the Sinai, who knows. The second one is the growing tension between the Sunni and the Shia. The Sunni world, they lost their champion. Egypt has been inward looking for too long. They see chaos in Syria and in Libya. And the rise of Iran more and more, and if ever there is a nuclear deal, Iran will receive billions of dollars and will be even more the superpower in the region. They control Iraq fully. They control through the Hezbollah Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and some key parts of the Middle East. The third aspect is the Arab Spring, and don't misunderstand what I'm saying, but some of these countries have a bit destructured in order to restructure their security apparatus. And there's a bit the case in point with Tunisia, because the security service were the arms of repression. Today, Tunisia is less well equipped than it was 4 years ago to address the return of thousands of foreign fighters. And finally, we should not forget the ideology. At the end of the day, this has an impact in Europe. A distorted interpretation of Islam has some impact. It's not just badly integrated second-generation migrants. These are vulnerable people on which ideology plays a role.
Okay. I mean, I think that's fascinating. And I mean, I have 2 questions for you. One, the competition between Daesh and AQ. You said it really play out with them competing to do the sort of biggest terrorist act in Europe. I mean, is there a possibility at some stage that they, although there have been clashes in Syria, that there is a confrontation, a bigger confrontation between the 2 groups directly? But the second question I have, which is, you mentioned Tunisia and Libya. I mean, these are European failures as much as anything else. I mean, I remember talking to a Tunisian minister last year who was saying how, the promises of trade liberalization, although technically many of them had done, the obstacles that the Tunisians still encountered in just trying to sell basic produce to Europe were huge. the access for young Tunisians to European universities where they would, increase their technical skills, but also perhaps absorb some of the liberal culture was restricted. So, isn't Tunisia potentially a European failure? And Libya, we sort of went in and, my own prime minister and the then French president went off and took the cheers in Benghazi and then just walked home.
To take the latter, I would agree that probably we have not been up to the challenge of the Arab Spring, and we should have been doing much more and much more quickly. As you said, we see young, promising intellectuals in the Arab world going to Kuala Lumpur because they get a scholarship and studying Islamic studies while they would have preferred to study medicine or engineering.
Yeah.
I fully agree on this. So we should be a bit more open in terms of access to university, free movement of circular migration and free movement of students. But the good news is that that was prompted by the Paris attack. The Minister of Foreign Affairs have decided, under the leadership of Mrs. Mogherini, to engage much more than before in our direct vicinity, in our backyard, because we know we are faced with a serious problem on the other side of the Mediterranean. And so I think in the coming months you will see a much more active Europe to beef up the resilience and the response of these countries to face the terrorist threat. As to the first one, I would rather see a sort of takeover by Daesh for either tactical reasons. Some group wanted to just bet on the winner because that helped them to recruit and get money and get support.
Okay, fine. Well, from our completely unscientific poll, the mood in this room is more security, but I'm sure everyone is aware that there comes a point where we give up our own liberties in order to make us feel more secure. But what's security without liberty? Where are we? There are huge debates, I think, on both sides of the Atlantic. And we have Susan Herman from the US Council for Civil Liberties here, and she's an expert. She's written a great book on this subject, Taking Liberties. Hold it up. Go on. So if you really want to look into this subject. So, Susan, how does it look? And I know obviously the US is where you are, but if you have any views on the balance in Europe as well, we'd be interested in those. Where do you think we are in striking that balance between security and liberty?
Thank you, Philip. The American Civil Liberties Union only actually acts domestically, so our focus is on U.S. constitutional law, as well as increasingly international human rights norms. But we're also now part of a coalition called the International Network of Civil Liberties Organizations, which includes Liberty in the UK, and Hungarian and Irish civil liberties councils and various other places around the world. I mostly know about the United States. And so I thought, obviously after 9/11, the United States did a lot in terms of changing our laws to try to counter terrorism. And there are many, we changed our laws about detentions, what were called harsh interrogation techniques, security screening, and many things in addition to surveillance. But because your question focused on surveillance, I think that probably will be our focus for today. So let me just say something about this poll, about the balance between liberty and security in terms of do we want more surveillance or less surveillance. I think to set the table for our later discussion, what I want to do, it's obvious to everybody what we're hoping will be the benefits of more surveillance, that we'll find out more about what people who are potential terrorists or actual terrorists are doing, and therefore be able to disrupt the plots. But I think it's more difficult to get a handle on what are the costs of too much surveillance. So what I want to do is I want to divide up the possible costs into 4 different categories. Number 1, which I think is the most obvious, is the threat to privacy, and that's something I think we'll be discussing. People have questions today about do we still have privacy anyway, and that's a very important discussion. Why should I care what the government knows about me if I'm not doing anything wrong? I think that connects up, however, to the second major threat, which is a threat to liberty in many ways. Privacy is connected with the freedom of speech, with the freedom of association, and the freedom of religion. And I'm happy during the Q&A to give you examples of what I mean by that, because I think this is not just a matter of what does the government know about me. I think that having some privacy from the government is a precondition of many of the liberties, freedom of speech and so forth that we want to exercise. The third concern, which is also very important, is a concern about equality. Philip, you were saying, don't we feel that we have to give up some of our liberty in order to be safe? Well, one of the conversations we're having in the United States is who's we? So I think a lot of people assume that they themselves are really not going to be very inconvenienced. They're not going to be locked up, and they're not going to be a major focal point of the government's investigations. It's only going to be the Muslim and Arab men. And so if it's not affecting me, I think it's easier for me to make a decision that's going to give up somebody else's rights. But the fourth, which I think the fourth concern, which is maybe the least obvious, is the connection between privacy and democracy. And so I just want to take a minute now and say what I mean by that. So it seems to me that one of the preconditions for democracy, and this is not just the United States, this is any democracy, is the idea that the people run the government, not that the government run the people. So what we have experienced after 9/11 is a kind of an inversion of that premise. So because surveillance has become so supersized, we're now gotten into a situation where the people have become increasingly transparent to the government, and the government has become increasingly opaque to the people. What we saw in the United States was that because of the fear of terrorism in the fall of 2001, I'm sure many of you have heard of the USA Patriot Act, that not only allowed a lot of surveillance, but it allowed the government agencies to keep secret from people what they were doing. Now, what this led to, first of all, was the sense that we just had to trust the government with all decisions about how much surveillance was appropriate. And therefore, people were not really, the public was not invited to be part of that debate. What that meant was that, first of all, the agencies by themselves were making law within themselves. And for a long time, this was under the Bush administration, our National Security Agency was actually operating in violation of the existing law that Congress had passed, because the president didn't want to have a public discussion about what was appropriate level of security. The other thing that we learned, thanks to Edward Snowden, was that we didn't know the half of what the government was actually doing. That when you give an agency too much power to conduct surveillance, very well-intentioned people are likely not to see the other part of the balance, because that's not their job. Their job is, how big is the dragnet that we need that we might catch terrorists? My job is to say, wait a minute, what about the unintended consequences? Is your dragnet too big? So what we saw were that very well-intentioned people were using the powers that they were being given.
That's as it, I'm going to push back, because that's as it was. I mean, things are now changing, and one of the things is governments are being obliged, and certainly in my own country, and I believe in the US, to be more transparent about what they're doing, and the legal constraints on those activities are being tightened. But I suppose the question is, if they are transparent, if there are legal constraints, shouldn't they be able to do this? If you take, in my own country, there's a lot of talk about mass surveillance of the population. It's not really mass surveillance. What people mean is that the government or the agencies hoover up all this data, this metadata, but they only use it when under strict rules which say, okay, they can interrogate that data for certain names. So this isn't mass surveillance. This is, we need to collect all the data in order to access information on the activities, say, of known terrorists. You can't get that access unless you have all the data. Now, it seems to me that the interrogation of the data, the conditions under which that's done, is much more important than the collection of the data.
I would say first, Philip, that I think both are important. In terms of the collecting the data, part of what collecting the data, if the government is collecting massive data, I think that has consequences. And because I don't want to be too lengthy now, because I know you want to have a conversation, maybe I'll just sort of lay that aside for now and invite, if people want to talk about what are the consequences of mass data collection. I think the problem is that we're trying to have a general conversation. And surveillance covers a lot of different kinds of surveillance, as you're saying. It covers not only the mass collection of data and metadata, but it also covers, in the United States certainly, collection of conversations that people are having of all sorts. And Yeah, it's subdivided. But the problem that I see is that what you're saying is that there are protections to make sure that all this information is only being used at appropriate times. First of all, I think that the collection itself does do damage. And second of all, certainly in the United States, we still have not gotten to the point where we have adequate accountability or checks and balances. So I think there's a very real danger of the potential of abuse of the collection of this information. But I think that my going into examples now would be too lengthy for just the beginning.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
I said at the beginning this is a huge and complex subject. We've had 4 sets, I think, of great insights into different dimensions of the subject. But rather than me go on sort of questioning, and I could stand here for a couple of hours doing this, I thought it'd be better that we open it up, not just for questions, but for a sort of conversation and for people to make points. And I'd encourage people not just from Europe or the United States, but from the people here from the region itself to chip in and give their views on any of the subjects we'd cover so far. So what I'll try and do is maybe take 2 or 3 questions, comments at one go, and then come back to the panel after each of them. So the gentleman here in the front.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to interact with Gilles. I recall, and when yes, I'm a former minister delegate of Foreign Affairs of Morocco, and we work in for a long time with the European Union. I'd like to recall, Gilles, when you came to see me in my office, I think 2 years ago, that we have worked as far as Morocco-EU relations on how to fight terror. And at that time, we said we have triple dimensions. Of course, today you have expressed them very clearly, the economic development, political reform, and so on. The other one is the fight against, exclusion. And the third dimension, which is, I think, very important today, is how to deconstruct the jihadist discourse. I think this is what, of course, data is important, exchange of intelligence, but today the major threat we're facing today is how we can work together to deconstruct the jihadists, because the situation is getting worse every day, and you know that, Even with all our strategies in Sahel, in Mali, we were not able to control. Even the French intervention in Mali, for example, it was essential, crucial to fight against Al-Qaeda, but we were not able because we needed a comprehensive and global approach to fight terrorism. And that's why today the religious dimension is essential. It is up to us to do our own homework at the level of the southern countries, of the Islamic countries, and we are doing this through the training of imams. I think this is one track that we should explore together. Of course, information, financing, and so on. Well, we've been working with the EU in this, but today it is a priority for us.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to take a couple more questions, interventions. The gentleman here, and then the gentleman over there.
Yeah, my name is Marcos Freitas. I'm from Brazil. And Susan, I wanted to ask you one thing. Once the genie is out of the bottle, how do you control it and the information that is out there? And the other question that I have for the panel is that I understand there is a responsibility to protect, like if I were going to use the United Nations term. But shouldn't we develop rules on responsibility while protecting? Because I think that's a major issue that we should discuss.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. And gentleman just there.
Yes. I'm İlter Turan from Istanbul Bilgi University. I will make 2 observations, and the panel might choose to respond to it should they so desire. The first one is I'm a bit concerned that we are focusing on new terrorism and at the expense of forgetting old terrorism. And in that context, I'm still wondering what happened to the murderers of Özdemir Sabancı in Turkey, to whom the government of Belgium extended so much hospitality. We don't know where these people are now. We're reasonably convinced that they are either in Belgium or in Holland. So let us not forget. This also relates to the other idea that the perpetrators of other terrorism, which the panel chose not to discuss this morning, are engaging in acts of extortion and other things in Europe to finance activities in the Middle East. So it's not just sending people, it is financing, and that financing goes as much to the old forms of terrorism that you are familiar with as today. And let me also just register a sentiment as to how things look when you look at it from Turkey. It seems that our European Union friends let their citizens enjoy liberties, and when these people come to Turkey and then cross over, they expect the Turkish government to limit liberties to help them. So they don't assume the responsibility. They expect the Turks to assume the responsibility. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to assume it together.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we've got 3 questions, 3 thoughts for the panel. And I think it's a powerful one. The need to deconstruct the jihadist discourse, to actually take on the ideology, as it were. And I don't think it's just for, governments. This is for communities. The second about the responsibility to protect. And the third, a rather spiky intervention about some of the contradictions in our policies and the sort of dual application of freedoms and the need not to forget old terrorism and the way that financing matters, as well as foreign fighters. Now, I'm going to leave it actually to the panel to say, is there any? You pick up what you would like from that. So
very
Gilles.
quickly, I fully agree. I see 2 different problems. The first is indeed the pure ideology, the hijacking of Islam and so on, where we have to do better, both in Europe and in the Arab world. What you do in Morocco to train the imams and what you try to do in the Sahel is quite impressive. And I think we support your efforts in this respect. And we should do that more. And that raised the question of internet, because internet is now the #1 booster of radicalization. And the good news is that in Europe, we've tried to balance a bit the negative aspect and the positive aspect. On the negative aspect, I think we want to be much more engaged with the internet companies to remove from the web the illegal content. It's a very tricky issue because we are a bit divided on the scope of free speech in Europe. We have First Amendment member states, like the Nordics, where you can say nearly everything, while in some other part of Europe, like Belgium, France, or Germany, you cannot deny the Holocaust, because that will bring you to a criminal court. So this is a bit tricky, but I think we have made significant progress, and we're more and more engaged with the internet companies. But on the positive side, I think there is now a growing recognition that we have to improve our strategic communication. We've started doing that with the event in Ukraine. But we need now to be much more strategic in the way we counter the single narrative of Daesh on internet, and we have started working on it. I think that's a very good news. As to the other part is the spread of radical Islam, very conservative Islam. I have a very serious worry to see countries in Africa who had I would say a moderate Sufi Malikite Islam turning into the most radical interpretation of Islam. It's not only in the Sahel. Remember the impact of the publication of Charlie Hebdo after the attack. 10 people were killed in Niger, churches were burned. And I remember President Issoufou saying, when I was a child, I was not even aware that I was a Muslim. And now look at the way the country is turning. Same in Mali. Diko, the head of the Islamists in Mali, has a very important political impact. But it's not only in the Sahel. The Swahili coast, the whole of Africa, northern Nigeria, all this turned into a very, very conservative. So how do we address this? So that's the first point. The second point on PKK, DHKPC, Sabanji, and so on. I think we work very much with Turkey to improve our bilateral relationship in terms of police cooperation, in terms of criminal justice. I would dream to see the opening of chapter 23, 24. We just discussed that before the panel, because my message to Turkey is the quicker they adapt their standard to the EU acquis in terms of justice and in terms of law enforcement cooperation, the more we will cooperate. I have done my best in the last years to ask member states to put more pressure on the PKK in Europe, because it's a criminal organization raising money in Europe, and because we wanted to send them the message that there is no alternative but to engage into a peace process. And I'm keen to see the Turks finalizing this peace process, because it is very important for the Turks, for us. It's a criminal organization we put on the terrorist list, but it's important also for foreign policy reason.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I'm going to go on to the Turkish minister.
I think we have to separate two things. First is how we deal with terrorism on ground. And I think they're using the terminology as you have used, Islamic State or Islamic terrorism, I don't think is the correct thing to do, because then we are naming something in a wrong wording and causing the rest of the Islamic world to feel bad. Okay. We have to fight terrorism when on the ground, yes, but of course we have to really define the process correctly. For example, we're talking about getting rid of Daesh. They have 15,000 to 30,000 militants. So what are we going to do when we are saying eliminating? Are we going to kill them all? Are we going to put them in prison? What are we going to do with them will be the question when we get rid of the organization. I think this is the aspirin treatment part of it. But there is an antibiotic treatment, which I think we have to go to the source, which creates terrorism here and elsewhere in the world. I think the source is mostly Europe, where I think there are so many people who feel that they are the other. And if Europe becomes more inclusive and don't close the doors to ethnic groups, to other religions, to really bring new colors and try to feel, to give the impression that these people have hope for the future, and also don't feel that they are outside of the circle. We have really good experience in fighting with terrorism. We lost 30,000 lives in Turkey, $100 billion of our sources. But we are now trying to finalize a process where we did the same thing. While we were fighting with terrorism on the ground, we gave new opportunities, new cultural rights, new investments to that region, health facilities. And those people, when they started feeling that they are a part of Turkey, more than ever, they joined us to finalize this peace process. So here there's a dilemma. But also, I think Europe must fight with radicalism and with terrorism. If terrorism and radicalism join each other, then it will be an even increased difficulty. But to fight with radicalism, I think you can't say, well, here it's a democratic country, so radical views can also be expressed. So we don't have any mean to stop it. I don't say stop any expression of feelings or views, but the mainstream groups which are using the European values, European standards, should also have to come out and express their views, saying that radicalism is bad, saying that terrorism is bad. So this is, I think, the panacea, and this is the antibiotic treatment.
Okay, I'm going to come to Derek Chollet. I don't know what he wants to say, but since he's on the home team, I'm going to sort of throw him a nice, easy ball as well. Why is it some of us wonder when a lot of the ideology we're talking about, and I think this point about you've got to confront the ideology is really important. A lot of this ideology derives from the extreme Islamic teachings of the Wahhabis. And the US and other countries go around talking about this moderate Saudi Arabia, our great ally, which is the source in a lot of Europe, Pakistan, elsewhere, of this most extreme version of Islam from which the violent terrorists draw at least succor and inspiration. So isn't there a sort of small sort of hypocrisy there in the way that we treat this?
I prefer to think of it as an issue we have to work.
I take small history. That's okay.
But I'll get to that. I have a couple thoughts. First, on the idea that we can't just kill our way out of this problem. I think anyone involved in the military campaign would completely agree with that. Whereas the military component gets most of the attention and is absolutely critical. This is going to have to be a bottom-up solution. And unfortunately, and this is getting to the point here, there's no silver bullet to that solution. The United States, our partners, have been working on what we call countering violent extremism projects for years now, and we still can't seem to get ahead of the challenge. We've had a lot of very innovative ideas. We've had a lot of very meaningful conferences and summits, including one just 3 weeks ago in Washington, but yet the problem still endures. It's probably one, frankly, that governments are not in a very good position to fix. So it's going to be something that will be engaged with the private sector and in the world of ideas in particular. In terms of the rules of the road, and I heard the question less about responsibility to protect, but how we actually do the protection. And what I'd like to say is we are trying to establish rules of the road, whether that's on terrorist financing, which is a key piece of the puzzle. There was a summit at the UN General Assembly last fall on terrorist financing to try to tighten our common laws against a lot of the money that flows out of countries like Saudi Arabia into extremist organizations. But also, and this gets to your world more, the rules of the road to ensure that as we are fighting terrorism, we are doing so and maintaining our legitimacy. We're not perfect. We're not there yet. I think President Obama does deserve some credit for trying to address head-on some of the more controversial issues in our debate about how we are going about fighting terrorism, particularly unmanned aerial systems, drones, and his willingness to talk about that publicly, to try to establish a framework for the use of that military capability into the future, which, by the way, is not just a capability that the United States operates and uses and sells. Other countries around the world do so. That other countries, by the way, that may not be as interested in being part of that international system as we are. So I think all of this has to add together to the project, but unfortunately there's no easy answer here, either on the military side or on the war of ideas, or actually on the legitimacy side.
Okay, Susan.
Shall I answer Marcus's question about the genie in the bottle? Muito obrigado. You can't put the genie back in the bottle in terms of we just do have less privacy in the modern world. But I think that what people often mean by that is that so much information about us is being collected and aggregated by the private sector. Yeah, Amazon, Google, Facebook, etc. And it seems to me that whatever we want our laws to be about data privacy generally, and that's a whole other big subject, trading in information, it's different to have the government having and using that information. For one thing, the last time I looked, Amazon couldn't arrest me if they didn't like what I was doing. They can't check my tax returns. They can't put me on a no-fly list. So I think the fact that government collects all this information, as I was saying, does have consequences all by itself. Let me give you two examples of how you go too far and affect liberty as well. So PEN, P-E-N, which is the largest international organization of writers and journalists, has tried a couple of studies recently. One was domestically within the United States, and the other was international. And they did a survey of all their members to ask whether their habits have changed about what they research, what they investigate, whether they're willing to go on websites and look up things about security systems at airports that they might want to write about. And what they found, roughly, depending on the question, they're very interesting studies, but depending on the question, something about a third of all their members said yes, they have in fact changed their behavior. They're not willing to have conversations and emails or phone calls. They're not willing to go on websites, and they're just not writing about certain topics. So that's number one. Now, what Derek was just saying, of course, financing is important, but there too, I think the previous administration really overdid it. And investigating Muslim charities, we have a major report that's about the attempt to investigate possible sources of funding from the United States. And in going around, the FBI was going around door to door and interrogating Muslims about their charitable giving habits. And not only is this a kind of a blunderbuss approach to try to do what should be more targeted, but it seemed to me that that was actually counterproductive, because what they were doing was they were alienating the people they talked to. Attendance in mosques was down, charitable giving was down, with no appreciable gain in fighting terrorism in this way. So I just want to say that overall, there was a very interesting report from the Human Rights Council in June about digital privacy and about the international human rights, not the American law. And what they said is we really have to look not just at whether surveillance is possibly going to disrupt terrorism, but we have to look at, is it proportional? What are we actually getting? How much of it is necessary? And what's effective? And I think that is a conversation we've barely scraped the surface of in the United States, and I hope you have a better one here.
Very quickly, what about what goes on the net, as it were? Should people be able to post anything at any time? Or should there be constraints, as we have in Europe? I mean, most,
Right.
as Gilles said, most conspicuously in relation to the Holocaust, but in other things in my own country, anti-racism legislation. Where is that balance? Should people, extremists, be able to just post what they like?
I think, and I would love to just talk individually more with anybody who would like to continue this conversation, but I think the United States understanding of our First Amendment freedom of expression is somewhat different from what you have in Europe. I've run into this in the past. So I'll give you one small example. There was a man from Saudi Arabia who was an exchange student at the University of Idaho, and shortly after 9/11, the FBI decided, I think quite mistakenly, that he was part of a sleeper cell at Idaho because he had been involved in contributions to Muslim charities. So he was prosecuted for material support of terrorism because he was running a chat room and talking about jihadist ideas and letting jihadists explain their own point of view, in addition to other people posting things about how that's not all of Islam, that's really not representative. He was prosecuted for a crime. And in Idaho, which is quite a rural, kind of right-wing state, the jury acquitted him because they were told that our First Amendment protects people who are saying things. So again, I think our First Amendment standards are perhaps different.
Okay, fine. So we're going to have another round, and the lady there, and then the lady here, and then the gentleman there.
Thank you so much, Stephen. My name is Risa Lutsevich. I'm from Chatham House in London, but I come from the region, a country called Ukraine, where actually the conflict, a crisis as it's called here, it's called anti-terrorist operation in Kiev. And there is about 40,000 mercenaries that are fleeing through the border from Russian state, supported by 12,000 Russian soldiers on the ground. On the other hand, we have Kiev government that is trying to protect the frontier from spread of what they call terrorism. I understand that the vote in the first the beginning of the session was saying this is not as much threat as Islamic terrorism to Europe, because I guess it's not threatening exactly the territory of the European Union. But I have a question perhaps to American colleague about how do you explain the strategy of President Obama, where you are providing military assistance in the Middle East, but at the same time, when you have quite capable state with quite capable army, you are reluctant to support, in the same time playing in Putin's protracted conflict strategy. Thank you.
Okay. The lady here.
Thank you. Ambassador Assia Ben Saralawi from Morocco. My question goes to Mr. de Kerchove, because he mentioned that Europe should do more with the North Africa and the Mediterranean at large. I'm surprised because yesterday Mrs. Representative, the High Representative, was supposed to talk about the other aspect that was tackled by the European summit, and she never had the chance to even mention what has been decided because the whole session was eaten up by Ukraine. I understand that Ukraine is a priority, but I would like to ask you how far, how deep European Union is ready to go to tackle the problem where everybody seemed to be totally stalled. Is it just a revamping of neighborhood policy and business as usual, or is it ready really to tackle the problem with the complexities that have been mentioned and with the huge challenge it's posing on both rims of the Mediterranean and to the eastern Middle East?
Thank you. The gentleman there.
I'm Hiroida from Japan's Kyoto News. I'm a columnist for the news agency. And my question is addressed to maybe to Susan Herman. You just mentioned the kind of a difference between Europe and America about the freedom of speech. And also, I think it may relate to the freedom of religion in Europe and US. And this question has something to do with the radicalization of the young people, Muslim population here in Europe. How do you see the so-called laïcité of France, you know, the secularism of French policy? I just wondering, you know, it seems to be not a freedom of religion, but a freedom from religion, and that may be alienating a Muslim population here in Europe, particularly in France, and you know, the young people cannot go to school or so-called public sphere with scarves, or even Christians cannot go there with you know, the crosses. And so, how do you see that kind of a situation in Europe, and what's the American point of view, maybe Turkish point of view, about secularism in Europe? That's my question.
Okay.
It's a little too long. So.
Thank you. This is going to be the last round, and I see two other people. I'm going to take those, so there'll be five altogether, and then come back for a final sort of word from the panel. So there was the lady right back there.
Hello, my work. Yes. Thank you very much. I actually wanted to. My name is Leila Aliva. I'm from the country which surprised, I think, Eastern Partnership last year by unprecedented crackdown on liberal civil society. Why I'm attracting your attention to that? Azerbaijan is a country rich with oil and gas, which is quite unique among Eastern Partnership states, also has a Muslim population, and it's a fantastic case study in order to understand the root causes of terrorism beyond the territory of Eastern Partnership and other cases. And in that regard, I would like to support what you said about Saudi Arabia and sources of terrorism. Exactly what we were observing last year is that the government tried to basically finish with civil society, which has a liberal foundation and which works with the West, the most pro-Western forces overnight. And you understand what will happen to the gap which created now. We have 500, at least, fighters in Syria. They will be coming back quite soon. And, you know, that's a very good case study. And this is what EU is doing by totally ignoring this. At least that's what I heard.
Okay.
Yes, that basically bringing the border of terrorism much closer to European Union. And I wanted to get
I think we're going to end it just there. Thank you very much. Now, yesterday when Stephen Erlanger of the New York Times was chairing a panel, I spent most of it waving my hand madly, trying to get in a question, and he blithely ignored me. So I just saw him just sort of wave his hand gently like that. So, Stephen Erlanger.
Now I'm ashamed. But I have terrible eyesight. I apologize for that. Anyway, I just wanted to say very briefly, because I'm running out of time. I mean, Europe will cope with this problem. The post-colonial period has been pretty short. And the way Europe has had to deal with a Muslim population that's pretty new to it, I think, you know, it's taken America 200 years and we're not very good at it yet. So I think, you know, people of goodwill will adjust. The problem is, and I haven't heard too much about this, what has helped to create this vacuum that Islamic radicalism has filled? It is us. It is our failed policies. It's our breaking apart of Libya like the Great Gatsby, carelessly leaving it behind. It's our moral failure in Syria to respond to our assumption from the beginning that Assad would fall by magical thinking, not understanding that he was not Gaddafi, that Gaddafi would have won without NATO intervention, so why would Assad lose? It's our failure to support the Maghreb properly, and perhaps it's our failure to push our allies in Israel hard enough to deal responsibly with the clear problem of the Palestinian fate. So this is part of our problem too. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you. So, 5 questions, and I will summarize them shortly but badly. We won't arm a government in Ukraine while we will arm lesser forces in the Middle East. Libya, I'm showing my own prejudice, was my emphasis here is, are we really, Libya and North Africa, are we really serious? Or are we just going to say this and just, as the ambassador said, just revamp the neighborhood policy and forget about it again? I thought there was a great phrase from a Japanese colleague about the meaning of laïcité in France, not freedom of religion, but freedom from religion. And is this the way to go? A warning about Azerbaijan and how repression in countries such as Azerbaijan, which we sort of, there was a period when we worried about democracy in countries like that. Now we sort of forget about it, but this will come back to haunt us. And Stephen Erlanger's eloquent metaphor of Gatsby-esque approach to the region. And this gentleman keeps going like this to me, which means we have to wind up, which means you only have about a minute each. So don't try and answer everything. Just maybe choose one from that selection. And actually, I'm going to go in reverse order. So we'll start with Susan.
Okay, thank you for the question. As I think you know, the United States is a very religious country. And in fact, our position is very different from that of France. And we really honor the right of every individual to express their own religion. But where I want to go with my remaining 40 seconds is to sort of ask a more general question. We were talking before about freedom of speech and there being possibly different cultural norms. So far, as Derek was suggesting, we've been having fierce debates within the United States about what's the balance between freedom of religion and security and surveillance and privacy and all of this. And what I really wonder, my question to all of you is, can we have and should we be striving for international standards and norms about that? So we have one debate within the United States. There is a case that is being appealed from the Investigatory Policy Tribunal in the UK to the European Court of Human Rights by Liberty and several of these other organizations about digital privacy, PRISM and all the collection. So, the EU may have one forum for answers to these questions. Turkey may have another. And given that, I think we do have some cultural differences in backgrounds. Should we be having this debate on more of a global scale? How much of this should be happening internationally, or do we just have to each struggle with these problems on our own?
Okay, Gilles, 1 minute. That was brilliant. That was 1 minute. 1 minute.
I can confirm, probably she had no time to dwell on this, but Mrs. Mogherini was very committed when we discussed how to react to the Paris attack and how we should address the challenge of Libya. So that will be translated into much more political engagement vis-à-vis the Gulf, vis-à-vis this balance Sunni-Shia that I've mentioned before, and a lot of more assistance to beef up the resilience of the country to face a common threat. So on laïcité, I think the more I see the rise of extremism, the more I think probably we should reflect on the French approach. On the failure, yes, I can only but confirm that, sadly. And finally, on privacy, we try to broker a common ground with the US on privacy through a sort of umbrella agreement on how to deal with privacy on both sides of the Atlantic. So that's one step.
Okay, Minister.
I think we have to define secularism correctly. A person cannot be secular. She can be Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, or atheist. The state can only be secular. And it is the responsibility of the state to make sure that every citizen, no matter what religion they believe, should practice their religion properly, and state should be the guarantee. So I think what France is doing is to create secular people is wrong. Turkey is a country, 99% Muslim population, and we are a secular country where we try to have everybody practice their religions correctly and fully.
Thank you. Derek.
So on the Ukraine question, I mean, the blithe answer is there's no one-size-fits-all solution for problems. I will just observe that last year when I was in government, and a year ago this month, as we were dealing with the Ukraine crisis, and all focused on the Ukraine crisis, the ISIL crisis, which I don't know that we actually called it ISIL crisis at that point, was unfolding as Ramadi and Fallujah and other towns in Iraq were falling. And we were all watching it from afar and playing around at the margins, and it wasn't until Mosul fell in the summer that all of us, the transatlantic community, sort of moved onto that problem. And it's a broader issue than just U.S. military support, of course, because last summer, as we were still watching Ukraine very carefully, we were also all working together, the U.S. and European allies, on getting tons of ammunition, lethal assistance to the Peshmerga to stop the flow of ISIL and the race to Baghdad. Let me close on Erlanger's point. And as I've recently left government, so forums like this are part of my therapy and the 12-step program I'm in. And I guess, Steve, I'd have to say it's, certainly I would redo some things. But I can't say it's all about us. I think if there's one thing that these are the burdens of a government official, is that you learn a healthy dose of humility about our role and how much influence we actually have when it comes to problems that are as deep as Libya, for example, where we had a lot of well-meaning assistance, but the Libyan government wasn't up to it, or Iraq. So it doesn't mean we should give up,
Okay.
but I think a healthy dose of humility is required as well.
Okay. I think the panel, this brilliant panel, I don't think would claim to have answered every question. I do think, certainly from my perspective, and I'm sure from yours, that it's illuminated many of the paths that we should be taking. So I think we should thank them heartily. Thank you.